Hello, you are listening to the Natural Healing Show for UK Health Radio. I'm your host, Catherine Carrigan, medical intuitive healer and Amazon #1 bestselling author. You can find out more about me and my work at catherinecarrigan.com and unlimitedenergynow.com. While you're there, definitely sign up for my newsletter so you can learn even more about how you can heal yourself naturally. Now, our guest today is Vincent Lowry. Vincent is a poet and an author. He is the author of 2 books of poetry, Dreams Reign Supreme, and also Surfing the Seconds. He's working on his 3rd book of poetry, and you can read his book on science fiction, Constellation Chronicles. You can find out more about Vincent Lowry and his work on Goodreads, which is the largest social media site in the world for readers and authors. While you're on Goodreads, definitely look me up, friend me on Goodreads. You'll find me there and all my 8 published books, 9th one on the way, and Amazon. Welcome, Vincent Lowry.
Thank you. Welcome.
Now, Vincent Lowry, do you think poetry can help heal the body and mind?
Yes, I do. As an author of both poetry and fiction, I actually believe that reading in general is a great stress reliever because it exercises the mind and has a tendency to put your worries into a better perspective. For example, I had a student who read Surfing the Seconds, my book of poetry, and she was feeling rather homesick. And so she said the book helped ease her mind about being away from her family.
Yeah, that's a great example. I know one of my books, my 2nd book actually, What is Healing? Awaken Your Intuitive Power for Health and Happiness. A lady told me she got the audiobook version, and she said that when she listened to my audiobook, she could run faster than she'd ever run before. So she would listen to my book while running. And she said she kind of did a scientific experiment because she would run without listening to my book and then run while listening, and she could run faster. So how do you think poetry helps us to heal the body and the mind?
I think it can heal better when it's positive and motivational and inspirational. It's not that I want to throw stones at the work that is not that, but I do feel that as a reader and a writer of poetry that I really feel inspired by verses that really stand out, that make me want to go out and do something, make you want to be a part of the world or help out the community. And so I feel that poetry can really have that impact, that emotional impact, when it has that positive experience.
Okay, so I know that you are a leader of a group on Goodreads, again, which is the largest social media site in the world for readers and authors. Can you tell us a little bit about what you do on Goodreads?
So on Goodreads, I'm a moderator of a group that's about 30,000 members, and it's a collection of readers and writers, and it is a huge place for them to gather, to collaborate, to talk about stories, to talk about poems as well. It was a place where I felt years ago, it was almost a decade ago, that didn't exist because a lot of groups were kind of like hands off. It has to be something specific. You can't post your own work. And I thought that was kind of a wrong way to go. So I created this group and said, everybody's invited, everybody come in and collaborate.
That's a great idea. Now, we're talking about poetry that heals the body and the mind. I would have to say, when I'm looking for uplifting poetry and an uplifting poet, my favorite is Rumi. And whenever I'm wanting a positive thought, if I turn to Rumi, I'm pretty sure I'm going to get something that'll just totally change my perspective. So what poems or poets do you find most uplifting and most helpful?
I'm a huge fan of Billy Collins. I love his book, Ballistics. It's one of his books, Sailing Around the Room. I just find when I read his poems, they all have such different takes on life and make you stop to think and saying, I never saw it from that perspective before. And I really love poetry that kind of, it takes a slice of life and it makes you kind of look back on it and saying, that's kind of neat the way that the author put it.
Right, having a different perspective. Now, how do you think it's possible that poetry helps to heal us?
I think that it helps to heal us in the sense that it takes us out of our normal day worries. Whether it be stresses at work, whether it be family issues, it helps us stop and kind of recalibrate ourselves and saying, given that all that's happened to us in the past and all our worries in the future, this is in the moment now where you're reading this poem, and this will help you kind of step outside your mind to see things from a different perspective and step away from those worries.
Right. So it's almost like shifting our energy, changing our vibration, again, like you said, helping us to see the world in a different way. Now,
Yes. Yeah, it definitely about perspective. Yeah.
Now, do you think that some poems heal better than others?
I do, in the sense that some connect better than others. Sometimes you have that poem that you'll read and it just doesn't have that impact, or maybe you don't understand it. I've certainly had that experience myself while reading a poem and saying either it was beyond my mind, something very abstract, or it was just something I just didn't quite grasp the nature of it like the author did. So I feel poems like that don't have that power to impact your life in that positive way, versus ones that really connect with you and saying, I get that. I've felt that before. And maybe you've never articulated that in words, but you see that in reading that and saying, that author connected with me in a very fundamental way that I really feel about that emotion or that subject.
Right. So I think poems are very personal. You mentioned your favorite poet. I talked about Rumi, who was a 13th century mystic. So, that was a long time ago, but a lot of his works are very timeless. Now, will we have better results reading one poem or reading a collection of them? What's your experience?
I think that the answer to that is actually a little bit of both. I think the poem that connects with you and you read it and say, wow, that was a really great poem, that you might want to step aside and kind of ponder that, maybe take a walk and kind of think those words over, think the verses over and how that connected with you. I also think that reading a collection of poems is a great way to have this sort of arc of the story, where you can kind of see where the poet's trying to go with more of these poems kind of collaborate together. Some poets write in a fashion where they kind of structure poems to kind of go one after the other, so it has like a theme. But not all poets do that. Some poets really kind of just step aside and talk about completely different things from one poem to the next. So I think the answer to that question also lies in the author themselves too.
Yeah, I know that if we're talking about a collection of poems, my favorite collection of poems is the Four Quartets by T.S. Eliot, which kind of go together.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a little
Yeah.
beautiful little book. Maybe takes you an hour to read if you kind of take the time and ponder each one. So when we're thinking about reading poems for personal healing, what do you think is the best way to go about reading?
I think is to first find a quiet spot where you're not going to be distracted. Obviously, if you're in an environment where the TV's on and the radio's on, and you have that poetry book open in your lap, I feel that already off the set, just environment-wise, you're not setting yourself up for that ultimate impact that poetry can have. You find a nice quiet space, whether it be outdoors or indoors, and get that book and really just focus in on those poems and let them see where they take you. I think that's the best way for that to happen, for the positive impact to happen.
Now, one of the things that I like to talk about here at the Natural Healing Show, I like to talk about things that are free or low cost. And, we all know for sure that we can get on the internet and read Rumi poetry, or you can buy a book of poetry at a very low cost. But as you said, to take the time to leave our regular life, set aside time for quiet reflection, and then allow the rhythm of the poem and the insights of the poem to kind of show us a different view of the world.
Yeah, that's right. And that's where you'll feel that impact when you're connecting with that poem in the way, hopefully the way that the author intended, not being distracted by 3 or 4 other things.
Now, if a poem makes an impact, is it better for us to read it multiple times? What is your thought on that?
I think that yes. I think that you can go back to that poem either that day or days later and reread that and saying, I want to see that poem again. I want to see why that stuck with me so well, and why that impacted you or motivated you. And I also think there's a healthy balance too. I think that if you read a poem too many times, you might, I hate to say getting tired of the poem, but it definitely won't have that same impact of maybe the first few readings. So I think there is a healthy balance of reading it once, getting that impact, reading it again to fully understand that, but not overdoing it at the same time too.
Well, I know, going to the example of the Four Quartets by T.S. Eliot, I think I first read that poem when I was maybe 17 years old. And yet, with great poetry, you can read it over time throughout your life and have different insights at different times. And it can reveal things at different times, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Are there poems that you have read over time that you found profoundly helpful?
Yeah, I think that Leaves of Grass, and Walt Whitman, I didn't mention him before, but he definitely stands out as a great poet in my mind. That, as in high school, I remember seeing some of his poems, and then in college, and then beyond college. So he's definitely a poet where I've gone back to, and it's made a different impact at different stages of my life.
Now, we're talking about poetry for healing. So when you think of healing and poetry for healing, how have different poems impacted you mentally and physically?
I think that mentally, 'cause I'm human like everyone else, and I've gone through issues in my life were much more troublesome. And I think during those times when there's tragedy or things you just don't understand that are impacting your life, I feel that that's, for me, the best positive impact, the best motivational impact that I've had about sitting down and reading a poem and getting through that stage of my life. I do feel that for me, particularly, that it was during those troublesome times, those tragic moments, where I was able to step aside and read something and kind of take my mind away from it. So I believe that the biggest impact of my mind can happen during those moments where you feel most vulnerable, most down, or you feel like this really lifted me up in that moment.
Right. Rumi, one of my favorite poets, he has a wonderful quote, and I'm probably going to be butchering it here, but basically he said, there's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. And I do.
Yeah, that's right. That's great.
Yeah, exactly. There's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. And I agree with you, Vincent, that sometimes when we're feeling a little bit down or anxious or we're feeling troubled, that's when we take the time to reach out for insight. Of course, we could reach out for insight and inspiration at any time in our life, but it's when you feel a crack in you that you're really most open to other people's wisdom. And of course, a lot of people turn to spiritual text, whether it's A Course in Miracles or the Bible or the Torah or any other spiritual text or the Kabbalah. But sometimes we're wanting to just look for a different perspective. So, and of course, many of the works of the Bible, like the book of Psalms, are poetry. What do you think the difference
Yeah.
is from your experience in reading poetry versus reading spiritual texts?
Well, reading the Book of Psalms, for instance, that's incredibly impactful, and you're talking about poetry that's been passed down through centuries, and there's something so fundamentally powerful by that, where you read the Book of Psalms and you're going through it, and there's so much that's in the Book of Psalms too. The Book of Psalms goes on for many, many pages. So I really feel that to me has this historical and spiritual and emotional impact that's really quite strong reading that. An author like Billy Collins, like I just mentioned before, is modern day, of course. Billy Collins is more for our day and age. And so you read that, and then you can kind of associate what it's like to be on a street and see cars and everything else that's associated with present day. And I think the two are different. It depends what you're looking for when you're reading. If I wanted something that had maybe a deeper, more humanitarian aspect to it, I might go to the Book of Psalms, so that way I can get impacted by that. If I wanted something that's more modern day, in the sense of a modern day author, I definitely would turn to those authors who are writing today.
Right. The other thing I think maybe different about reading poetry versus spiritual books is sometimes we're wanting to read an author from our perspective. So, for example, someone of African American heritage may turn to a poet like Langston Hughes, right? Or, a woman might look to Gertrude Stein or some other female author. So sometimes we want to hear from someone of like mind, as you say, of current generation, whether it's our sexual orientation or our cultural orientation, who can give us a perspective, a higher perspective, but it's not necessarily religious. Now, when we're wanting to work on poems to heal our body and mind, do you think we should stick with reading one poet or try the works of many poets?
I think trying the works of many poets is a good idea. I think trying ones that existed hundreds, if not thousands of years ago, because it does go back that far, where you're able to see these different authors and what they might have lived through and what their perspectives were through their generation. And, I think the only way that you can get a firm understanding of different types of poetry and the different impacts of poetry is by studying different authors.
So can you give us an example from your own life of how poetry has healed you or made an impact on your own body and mind?
I think that the tragedies I mentioned before that were in my life, I went through a divorce. And so that was a very difficult time for me. And that was a moment where I stepped aside. I do photography as well, so I did both photography and poetry. And so writing poems down that, in the moment I might be in a field of flowers. And I just, if I got the chance, I got out a piece of paper and a pencil and I wrote something down that was kind of inspirational for me at the time, or helped me kind of reevaluate what I'd gone through in my life. So that, for me, is a particular specific personal experience that I'd had in a very dark time that helped me overcome that and help me see different perspective on it and to be able to move past it.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. I know for myself, I started writing poetry at a very young age as well. I wrote poetry as a teenager. In fact, I had some of my poems published when I was a teenager. And I wrote poetry, and then I wrote 12 plays. In fact, I had 3 plays produced off Broadway in New York. And then I started writing books. But I remember writing the poems was very healing and very comforting. So for myself, when I started writing poetry, it felt that my soul was actually speaking to me, and I was able to put down not just what I was feeling, but messages from the soul.
Right. Yeah, it's the gift of writing. It's the gift of being able to communicate at a very emotional level through writing.
Yeah. Now, what's interesting, I have to share this with our audience. I just finished writing my 9th book. And I remember working on my 9th book for about a year. And I do all my work prayerfully. And my guidance had told me that I was supposed to write on a certain subject. And I had this battle going on in my head between my ego and my soul, because my ego was, the typical thing. What do you know? Nobody will read this. Are you sure? Are you sure somebody wants to read what you have to say about that subject? But my whole soul kept insisting that I write, and you can see I'm not revealing what it's about because I'm not ready to talk about that yet. So I had this battle going on inside me, which was frankly quite exhausting. And I would write a little bit, and then I would get discouraged and I would stop writing. And then finally, in a couple of weeks ago, I went to a writing conference to spend some time to finish the book. And I remember showing up at the writing conference completely exhausted. I'd had a lot going on. I'd been renovating my house. Everything in my house seemed to be breaking down all at one time. And I remember usually before I go to a writing workshop, I rest because I know how exhausting it is, because you write nonstop for days on end, usually at a pace of over 500 words every 15 minutes. So anyway, I show up this writing workshop. I'm completely exhausted. I'm so tired. I'm like, I don't know how I'm going to write anything, but here I am. And the first day and a half was quite difficult, but by that third day, I really got into the flow of it. And it was very fascinating to me because by the end of the workshop, when I had finished the rough draft of my book, I felt like a totally different person. I thought, this is really, really interesting. How can this be? How can I show up completely exhausted and then write nonstop from about 8 a.m. or 9 a.m. to 6 or 6:30 every night with a break for lunch, and then feel rested and whole and calm and happy at the end? I thought that was very interesting, but it was as if I had gotten out what I'd been wrestling around inside of me. Do you have any examples of that from your own life where you felt better after writing something?
Yeah, I do, and it depends how one looks at it. I mean, some people see it as purely internal, a struggle that goes on where it's like you have these doubts in your mind. Also, from religious standpoint, some people see it as a spiritual attack in a sense, where it's like you feel this negativeness about what you're trying to accomplish. I've experienced that tremendously so in my own work, particularly in this newest book called Flow, where I do have these doubts and I do have these moments where I'm like, just exhausted, or it says that, why am I bothered writing? And so I think what's truly inspirational is when you overcome those moments where you just push on through, almost like a barrier, and you say, I'm going to plow through ahead and just see what comes out of this. And your experience that day where you felt at the end of the day astonished, like, I can't believe I did that. Like, I was able to push through that entire day and get that done. I think it's those moments where you test out your limits and you accept the positive notion within yourself, the love, so to speak, as to say, I can do this. And now I'm going to ignore these doubts inside of me, and whether they come from me or from elsewhere, whether it be other people perhaps even telling you that you can or can't do something. That you push aside everything and say, I'm going to be the poet I need to be, I'm going to be the writer I need to be, and plow through these obstacles.
Yes, absolutely. And definitely plowing through the obstacles as an author is very rewarding. But to me, I,
Yes.
I even wrote an article about this called The Mystery of Being a Writer. Like, how can you show up so tired that I didn't think I was going to be able to hold my head up? Somebody smashed my
Yeah,
mailbox,
that's right.
both my websites crashed, I didn't get enough sleep. And then you write nonstop and you're not exhausted anymore. Like, how could that happen?
Yeah.
Right? It's truly
Yes.
a
Yeah,
mystery.
that's right. How are you able to get through it? That's definitely true.
Yeah. And, you know, I really, I could, come up with different theories, but I'm not really sure that I have the information about why that happened, and how it was so healing. I remember at the beginning of the day when I had my breakthrough, I got up at 4 a.m. I was in a different time zone, 3 hours earlier than I usually am. So I was really disoriented as far as my time schedule goes. And I had about 70 photographs that are going into my ninth book. And before I went to the writer's workshop, I had made an effort to organize them, but I had written a chapter about one of the photographs. And then I woke up at 4 a.m. and I realized I couldn't find the photograph. So I was sitting there lamenting what was going on, beating myself up. Oh my God, you're so disorganized. How do you think you can write a book? And then suddenly, again, it all came together. And I saw why it was so important to write about that subject, and also why I needed to write it, and how it came together in a very special way that was simple and clean and easy to understand. And I had assimilated a lot of information in a way that I think everyone could understand.
That's
Now,
right. Yeah.
I know, Vincent, Lowry, I know that you write both poetry and novels. What do you think,
That's correct. Yeah.
going back to the experience of reading, because some of our audience will be writers and some of us will be readers, what do you think is the
Mhm.
difference between reading a great poem versus reading novels?
I think a poem really will touch on a specific emotion, or a specific instance in a moment. Like, you could write a poem about a leaf, you know, you could write a poem about a feeling of forgiveness. Um, and, you could have 2 or 3 pages of that poem. I think with a book, it takes you, of course, through the arc of the character. And you follow that character from the very beginning and all the relationships that character will have with other characters, and you follow the plot on through, so it has this theme to it where you want to see what the end result's going to be. And so I think in that situation, books can have a very deep impact if the author achieves that goal of carrying the reader from the very beginning to the end with a huge emotional impact or involvement with those characters. And I think a poet can also make an impact, but it's a very different one in the sense that you get a page or 2 pages to really stress the point of that particular instance or emotion to connect with that reader. And it's a different type of connection, but it can have a great powerful impact of that as well. The last book that I wrote is actually called American Vineyard, and it was 600 pages. And so it was a book that it was a work that took me almost a decade to get finally done and published. And I was grateful in the sense that it placed as a finalist in a very special award that was in my home state. So I was very pleased about that. But more importantly, I was pleased to get it done. That's,
Yeah.
when you have a book that's that long, you start to question yourself whether or not you're ever going to finish this, or more importantly, whether anyone's going to care. And so I felt, when all was said and done, kind of your same experience when I plowed through those obstacles and got that book out and done, that it created this work that created this connection with the readers who had read it, that was very deep and powerful in a way that I must admit that I probably couldn't have captured through poetry.
Yeah, and I really appreciate what you're saying, where you're talking about poems do a wonderful job of helping us to explore our emotions and feeling states, versus novels
Yeah,
take you on a journey. They take you on the transformation of the characters, right? Which we can all relate to. And I
that's
know,
true. Yeah, poems can be, in a sense, poems can be more personal that way because of that emotional impact. It sometimes forces you to look within yourself.
yeah, and here at the Natural Healing Show for UK Health Radio, one of the things that we realize is that our emotions drive our healing process. And emotions can make you sick and lower your vibration and keep you stuck in a state of hopelessness and depression and anxiety. Or emotions can also transform you, but you can't ignore them. And so having a method
Yeah.
like a poem to explore different emotional states, whether you're exploring the hopelessness or exploring the anxiety or exploring the anger or whatever it is, and having another way of looking at that feeling from another perspective can help you move through it. Now,
That's right. Yeah. One emotion I want to mention is the emotion of forgiveness. Because that one is very difficult. When you think about people who have harmed you in the past, and it could be very recent too, where you have to explore that notion of forgiving them and moving on and finding love for that person as well.
yes, and I agree. And forgiveness, there's certain frequencies, healing frequencies, if you will, they're incredibly powerful. And the more that we can learn to forgive and learn how to forgive and learn how to forgive over and over and over again, the deeper and more profound our healing will be. So, as you said, when you read a novel and you read this journey that someone's gone through, even if there was great difficulties, if they can let go of the pain and let go of the resentment, then that helps us learn how to forgive. Now, Vincent Lowry, author of both poetry and novels, what sort of comments have you heard from readers who have read something that has made a healing impact?
One reader said that Surfing the Seconds was full of love, joy, and music.
Hmm.
I love that comment on there, especially the joy and the music part of it, because that to me was something that obviously meant a lot in terms of a healing impact for that reader, who could almost dance with the verses. And for me to be able to write poetry and have a poem connect in that way is tough to do, and it's great when you see that it happens, because you only see the result when they leave a review like that. Sometimes they never leave a review, and so you're left questioning as the author whether or not you hit the right mark on either a book or a poem. And so when you're given the opportunity to see a review like that, that's when you realize that, okay, this made an impact. And that's one particular example of a reader who left that.
Yeah, that's very powerful. And I agree, one of the ways that we authors can be appreciated is by people leaving reviews and talking about how our words have improved someone's lives, right? But if you think about
That's right.
dis-ease, all dis-ease is low vibration. And we've all experienced this. Say when you have a cold, you feel sluggish, you can hardly get out of bed. And yet all healing happens when you raise your vibration and you lift your vibration. So when we're reading something that gives us insight or helps us to explore what's going on in our own psyche, that helps to shift at a very, very deep level. Now, what if we read a poem? I know personally I've read plenty of poems that I thought, I don't know what they just said here. I know it's a bunch of words, I know it rhymes, I know it's got a rhythm, but I'm not quite sure I really understand what it means. What if a poem goes completely over our heads? In other words, it just doesn't connect with us. What's your insight about that?
Yeah, for that one, two suggestions. The first is probably to try to read it again, to see if maybe a second reading will help you understand what the author meant to say. And certain authors can use very abstract language, where it really causes you to sit down one word at a time, one line at a time, to see where they're going with it. Because they could be using metaphors, and other things that create complexity within the poem, where you're trying to understand exactly what they mean. If you spend a couple of readings and you still don't get it, maybe try reading a few more by that author to see if more are like that, or if that was just an exception and the other ones are connecting with you. And I do feel that if you have one of those poets where you just don't have that same impact, it's kind of all going over your head, you might have to step aside and find a different poet.
Find a different poet, absolutely. I know one thing that helps me if I don't understand a poem, believe it or not, is actually reading it out loud. There's something
Yeah.
sometimes about, the vibration of the words itself, or the rhythm, the vibration, and actually hearing it. Just like music is meant to be heard, and poetry, I believe, is often meant to be heard versus novels. We usually, when we're reading it, we're reading the words silently to ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what about writing poetry? How healing do you think it is to write poetry?
I think it's very important, as you mentioned in earlier, how you were able to sit down and write, even during those times you mentioned that you didn't feel like writing, and it was very inspirational at the end of that process of getting that writing done. I believe that is not an exception just to writers. I believe it applies for anybody who sits down and writes a poem, or even a story, that you'll find it very encouraging when you sit down and you're able to kind of get through those barriers and those blockades and get something down on paper. Now, we all question our work at the end of the day, where we write something down, we're not sure what we put down, if it's what we want to say. But there is something that's about progress, that's encouraging, that's motivational, that has a deep impact when you are able to write down on a piece of paper, 500 words or 1,000 words. There's that sense of achievement that at the end of the day, no matter what you've put down, it's there. And you can always go back and edit it to the point where maybe most of it will be edited, or if not all of it. But at least you have that down to work with. And when people commonly say, well, how do you write a 600-page book? You write it one word at a time. And and that's how it works.
Yeah, well said. One line at a time, one word at a time, one chapter at a time. Even while battling your ego. One of the things that I would
That's
say
right.
about poetry, again, is if you write about how you're feeling, even if you write in a journal, and just write a few lines, maybe at the beginning of the day or the end of the day, about how you're feeling. And not really, don't worry about whether it makes sense or not. Don't worry about whether you're going to ever read it to anyone or share it to anyone. But it's a matter of just getting the information out, getting the feeling out, getting the emotion out, and expressing it. Because sometimes we're hiding the emotions and hiding the feelings even from ourselves. And Sigmund Freud, who many people credit for being the founder of modern psychology, he said, buried feelings never die. They show forth in many uglier ways. So when we take the time to write a poem about how we're feeling, whether it makes sense to anyone or not, whether we like it or not, if you can simply get out how you're feeling onto a piece of paper, you're moving that energy so that it's no longer inside you. and it's a very powerful step towards healing. What's your insight, Vincent Lowry, about getting our feelings out of us and onto paper?
Onto the page, yeah. I feel that that is important. I think poetry in particular can help you express those feelings that may be bottled up inside, that you probably don't even know exist, until you start writing it out and thinking about a particular emotion or a particular person. Sometimes it could be about a person in general who's hurt you or you have hurt. And you start writing about that experience and putting it down on paper. And as you do that, your mind starts gathering other information that really wasn't apparent to you, that says there's more going on with this that you've got to put down. There's more going on with this circumstance that you've got to move past. And so as you write that down in a poem, you begin to realize the raw emotions that are there. And that's part of the healing process too. You know, like I mentioned my divorce before, when you start putting down those raw emotions down on paper, and then ultimately forgiveness and moving on and moving past things, that you realize that this is what it's going to take. This is what forgiveness is about. This is what moving past this and finding the love again is about. And you know, that's ultimately what most people want in life, is to be able to love and be loved. And so, you know, if we explore that to the best of our abilities by writing down our emotions, writing down our thoughts, and finding that place of love and to love others, I think that is ultimately beneficial, and something that may be very astonishing for the writer to realize at the end of the day, when they've written either one poem or a collection of poems, how that's all come together to really get out their emotions and to show them this is what was inside and what's being brought on the page, and to read that over in your own mind and say, oh, wow, I didn't know that was there, and yeah, I do need to go through this process in order to heal.
Very powerful testimony. Now, Vincent Lowry, if we've never written a poem before, how does a person get started?
The great thing about poems is you don't need to be an expert. You know, you mentioned being in high school and writing some poetry down and some work down, that some of which was published too. And I was kind of in your same boat. I was in the high school yearbook, and used to be a writer as a result of yearbook class. And I think even before that, even in middle school, I kind of dabbled in it. That's the greatest part about poetry, is you just write down what you have inside. And another good thing too, it doesn't exactly have to make 100% sense. You're not writing a story followed from point A to point B to C. It's a poem that just is dealing with either, as we said, an emotion or an event, or something that just might be something inside that you have to get out. So don't think that you have to have, 20 published books. Don't think you have to have even one. Anybody can do it, and it just, as we said before, takes a word at a time, a line at a time, just to get it out. And I feel that if most people who are depressed tried that, turn off the TV or turn off the movies and whether other distracting devices, cell phones particularly now, you put those aside, especially social media. Put that stuff aside. Sit down, think about your own thoughts, write down a poem, and get yourself outdoors and do so. And I'd be surprised if you didn't have a positive impact doing that.
That is just really great advice. Yeah, sit on a bench out in a park someplace and write about what you're really feeling inside. Now, how do you feel about sharing our work? Because what if we show our poems to someone and they don't understand what we're feeling, or they judge what we're feeling?
I feel that sharing work is something internal that you do have to gauge yourself. Some things are so emotionally raw for a person that they may just want to write it out just to get it out and have it there, versus other people that write something that something they want to tell others, because it certainly does have a healing impact. Telling a close friend, or telling people that are friends, or maybe even strangers too as well. to say, hey, listen, this is something I wrote down. I want you to think, read it over. Tell me what you think about what I wrote, and you know, and sharing that work with them. I mean, and if it lifts up their spirit too, um, that's a great deal. Is be able to write something that lifts your own spirit and share it with 5 others, and 4 out of 5 lifts their spirit too.
Yeah, then you're literally impacting the world, right?
Yeah, one person at a time.
One person at a time. Just like you write one word at a time, you can have a positive healing impact one person at a time. Now, Vincent Lowry, you
That's right.
are author of 2 published books of poetry, Dreams Reign Supreme and Surfing the Seconds. And I know you're working on your 3rd book, Flow of Poetry.
Yes.
What are your poems
Yes.
about?
The one in the new book, or the ones that, the newest one actually, you talked about the Book of Psalms, and I decided to delve into both the Old and New Testament just to see what I can do in terms of creating poetry around the things that I read in that. And so for me, that was a real great experience, for just delving into the different poems that are in there and talking, because poetry is in the Bible, as we talked about before, and being able to take that and saying, well, let's see what we can do. Not to improve on the work, I'm not trying to do that, but just saying, as an author, how is it that I can talk about this too as a creative person, in my own way of talking it out. And so that was really, the flow is about that. It's called Poems of Faith. And so for me, it was just a really cool thing to get into and do, and challenging too, because I want to make sure I get it right, and don't want to create something that people read it and saying, well, what is this that you wrote? And, you know, I mean, you can't please everybody. I understand that. But by the same token too, I wanted to create a book that was just as healing as Surfing the Seconds was, if not more so. I mean, I want to create something that's positive, that's inspiring, that's impactful. And there's actually one particular poem called Greater Good that's in that. And I wouldn't mind reading that if we had time at all, but that's okay if we don't. So.
Please read that. We would love that.
Sure. Well, give me 1 second here.
All right.
Can you see me still?
Yeah, absolutely. So you've been listening.
Great. It's called.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. So Vincent Lowry is going to read The Greater Good.
Greater Good. If you can read these words on a screen ignited from within by a modern-day marvel of light summoned by code, if you can react to it by using your finger to speak, or pass to the next room, or exit the door to the digital hotel we've collectively created in a connected yet emotionally removed world we should never fully inhabit. If you can place yourself in shoes atop a mountain 1,000 miles distant, a shore and ocean removed, a field alight by a new or retired sun, if you have the basics, essentials, that which keeps the heart and mind in a clear and steady state, and still have something to give, to teach, or donate, follow the higher path, the greater good, elevating 2 spirits with 1 act, finding the core of living, the center of purpose, the pulse of humanity.
Thank you so much. I got a chill just listening to you. You've been listening to Lowry, poet and author. You can find out more about Vincent Lowry and his wonderful work on Goodreads. While you're there, also look me up, Catherine Carrigan, on Goodreads, and also Amazon. You've been listening to the Natural Healing Show for UK Health Radio. I'm your host, Catherine Carrigan. Visit my website, CatherineCarrigan.com, and UnlimitedEnergyNow.com. And while you're there, definitely sign up for my newsletter so you can learn even more about how to heal yourself naturally. And remember, whether you're reading poems or writing them, poetry is a very powerful tool for natural healing. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.